So, what exactly do you mean when you say, what do you mean?
I do not understand this. This really confuses me.
What's that supposed to mean?
Literally.
What's that supposed to mean?
What's that supposed to mean?
I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about?
What's that supposed to mean?
Cultural anthropologist Ujwal R. Kalgood and Motive Base president Jason Partridge will tell you that perception and meaning are the primary pressure points that shape and create the world we live in.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word.
Let's explore why meaning matters.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
Now, here's your host, Aaron Trafford.
Welcome back to Why Meaning Matters. So we've had a few episodes left in this season of the show, and over the last 9 or so episodes, we've covered tons of ground. We've talked about how meanings shift, how they change, how they become myths. We've talked about the opportunities available for companies, organizations, political parties, so on and so forth, to leverage meaning to grow influence, revenue, to create change. And in the last few episodes, we also had some fun sort of unpacking these more nuanced concepts like the meaning of gender, femininity, feminism, understanding things like the social contract, social cohesion, how it all plays into how decisions can and should be made by marketers, by leaders, by society, period. So, of course, I'm joined again today by Jason and Ujwal from Motive Base. They're the brains of this operation. And guys, here's the question I have. And this might seem like a really silly question, but I have to ask it because I know if I have the question that other people have the question too. So here it is. I'm just going to put it out there. How are we measuring this? Like, how does this actually work? You've built your entire company on the foundation of meaning. But how are you doing this?
Yeah.
Lift the curtain a little bit for us so that we can put this into context now.
Yeah, all of this is based on a field of anthropology that we call structuralism or structural anthropology. And what it says, it's a 100-year-old field, by the way, and what it says is actually quite simple. If you want to understand the structure of the human mind, the way we give meaning to the world, we have to study the structure of language. That's the fundamental principle. Now, there's another caveat to that fundamental principle, which is that we have to study the structure of natural language. And that natural piece is crucial. It means we cannot take a survey, analyze it, and go, that's how meaning is given. That's not natural. I've been asked to do something. I'm not just naturally engaging with the world around me. We can't take a bunch of people, put them in an online community and say, here are 5 questions, guys, go talk about this. And then analyze it and go, oh, we found some patterns. Not natural. So when it comes to analyzing natural language, that's sort of the core tenet of structural anthropology. That's how we get at meaning that is naturally developing in culture. Now, of course, when a lot of these structuralists were developing these systems, proving them out, there was no internet, there was no natural language processing and machine learning and all of these other tools that we now have at our disposal. And I think many of them would have loved to be alive in this day and age because we have now literally taken their frameworks and brought them to life because we now have millions of people in natural conversation with one another on the internet. And these millions of people are talking about pretty much anything and everything imaginable. And especially in places like forums where they get to hide behind pseudonyms, they're open to being vulnerable. Jay and I joke that if a man can talk about erectile dysfunction and a woman can talk about her body, those are the places where we need to be in culture. Because we want to be in places where the most vulnerable conversations are had, where people are open to saying the things that they can't otherwise say or talk about, sometimes in real life, even with their own partners. And that's sort of the core tenet, the foundation of where all of this comes from.
I also love to think about it
almost kind of like when you think about a topic or a trend or an idea, like think of it as like a sphere. Think of it as something that is like round and it has mass. So let's take let's just pick one. Let's pick probiotics. So probiotics, let's assume, weighs 10 pounds. So why does probiotics weigh 10 pounds? It weighs 10 pounds because the things that people associate with it weigh 10 pounds. Things like gut health, things like the gut microbiome, things like leaky gut. All of these things basically are taking up space in consumer culture. But if something now comes into that culture that is bigger, that has more mass, let's say Oprah Winfrey all of a sudden says that she's now really invested in probiotics because it's really helping with weight loss, and weight loss weighs 1,000 pounds. Now all of a sudden probiotics takes on some of the mass from that other topic. The association starts to transform not only how we think about it, but how prevalent it is in culture. This is what Ujwal is describing. This is the theory that goes back to what these social scientists were leveraging back in the day. The difference is now is that we have the ability to actually map and track these changes over time.
Okay, so my mind is blown. Can we start at the beginning? Pre-internet, how were they measuring this versus now? How are we measuring that? Like, how do we get into those hidey holes of the internet where men are talking about ED and women are talking about their body?
Right. Pre-internet, the only way they could analyze this was through literature. So, in the 1920s, 1930s, they were analyzing, and I mean, philosophically, there's a whole field that assumes that actually written word is more valuable than spoken word. And so that was sort of the principle behind this. And so they started to analyze written words. So letters, newspaper articles, journal articles, stuff like that. So that's how they would analyze the language used in a context. And as they would analyze, and back in the day, they might analyze 20 pieces of content and conclude that, hey, this thing has a particular set of meanings, and then reanalyze that a year later and discover, oh, interesting, the meaning has evolved. So that's how they were doing it back in the day. Now we can do this with big data. So we're getting millions of people having this type of conversation, having millions of these conversations. We can also scrape the data every single day, and we can model how meaning is changing every single month and identify triggers that change meanings very, very quickly. So it's the principle is the same. It's just the scale and the access is what has changed. And the storing of it all. But and I think the interesting part, and this is the part that I wanted to call out, is it's not about specifically what is being said.
Or who is saying it.
Or who is saying it. It's about the words being used when that thing is being said. So let's try to picture this in our minds. Let's picture a conversation among a group of people. And let's make this about the pandemic. And in fact, this is a true story. I was sitting at a patio the other day, and I overheard 3 guys having this conversation. The first guy starts this conversation. He mentions the words COVID and vaccine. So he sets the context. This is about the COVID vaccine. The other 3 around the table respond, but in their responses, none of them use the words COVID vaccine, but they all engage in context. One person talks about the spread of disinformation. So what has he done here? He has associated disinformation with COVID vaccine. So it's sort of going back to the analogy of the solar system. If COVID vaccine is your sun, now there's a new planet, disinformation. The next person talks about distrusting pharmaceuticals, uses the term big pharma. Another planet has been introduced into the solar system. The next person after that talks about something else. Maybe they're talking about collusion or about data or privacy or whatever. Another planet. So this is an example, a rudimentary example of how in context 3 new planets just popped up out of nowhere. Now, imagine that this is happening at the scale of millions. There are these planets developing, and what we can do is quantify and determine which planets are closest to the sun at any given point in time. That's how we analyze meaning. We're analyzing the words used in context to then extract what exactly something means. And in fact, meaning is never singular, so usually we extract a multitude of meaning through
It's the
this type
Kevin
of
Bacon
analysis.
6 Degrees of Separation, but the anthropology version.
So when do we all get to dance? But I mean, so, okay, I have so many questions. So we talk about how now, I mean, when what you help your clients do is read that room, which we've now actually realized is a solar system. I mean, there's a lot going on. But jump onto that meaning as it develops into a myth. So how many planets do there need to be, or how big do the planets need to get before it goes from being just a conversation between three dudes on a patio to being something of mythic proportion?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's the first episode, we talked about how ideas go from myth to truth. And when enough people agree on it, it becomes just innate truth. Now, the problem in culture is that by the time something becomes truth, we all just innately know of it. And I use the example of, we all believe that if we meet somebody who wears glasses, they're more likely to be intelligent, smart, what have you. That's an example of a truth in culture because we just innately know it, we believe it, right? Now, and that's fine. When meaning develops and becomes truth, we know of it. The problem is, in the context of our clients and their business, that's too late, right? There's no point in waiting until something becomes the truth and we all know of it. And so the whole purpose of us doing this type of analysis is so that we can identify things while they're still in myth stage, while the meanings are still developing, to use the mass analogy of Jason's earlier, while we can identify while these triggers are developing so that we can run predictions, help our clients understand when something will in fact become truth.
Does this work with anything? Like, it works with anything?
Yeah. It works with pretty much anything. I mean, as long as people talk about something and it's relevant, it works with anything. And, not to get too philosophical here, but structuralists argue that if you can't use language to talk about something, it doesn't exist. Right? That's the philosophical argument behind this, because the argument is even in our heads, we use language to think about and understand something. So if we can't use language, it just doesn't exist. And so really what we're trying to figure out is how much does something exist in culture, right? How much, as in how much consensus have we built around it to the point where it exists and has just become complete truth. And sort of the crazy example of this, or the extreme example of this, is Pol Pot, the Cambodian dictator who just went on slaughtering people who wore glasses because he thought they were intellectuals. Just because they wore glasses. That's an example of it taken to the extreme, right? Where the meaning is that, oh, you wear glasses, you're likely to be an intellectual and you're likely to oppose my regime, right? Think about the connections he's just made there. And our job is to be able to model this type of meaning development and obviously arm our clients with knowledge that allows them to be more preemptive, more proactive.
So I need to actually go think about what you just said for a hot minute, because there's so much here. But the next question I want to answer for our listeners and on the show is the one now, I think, about trust and privacy, because you mentioned big data. In the 1920s, we were reading books, journals, newspapers, memos, but now we have the internet. So I think we need to have this conversation about what does this mean for trust, especially in the current climate. So I'd like to take us there in the next show, if that's cool with you guys.
Totally.
Awesome. Okay. This
Sounds
is
great.
Why Meaning Matters. Thanks so much for listening. If you have a question or a comment about the show, please feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com. Subscribe and share this show with your colleagues. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Why Meaning Matters with Ujwal Arkulgud, Jason Partridge, and your host, Aaron Trafford.
Inconceivable! You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Why Meaning Matters is produced for Motive Base and the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.